My next Patreon question is from Trevon, who wanted to know if I think the early to mid-2000s was a renaissance era for modern-day Hollywood. As someone who went to the movies a lot during that period, I do have fond memories of that time. That's even when I began broadening my horizons more about the types of films I sought out. And I do think Hollywood made several strides during the early to mid-2000s in what entered production, although there are a few areas I don't look back on with rose-tinted goggles. Every decade, people bemoan that Hollywood is out of ideas, but when you actually look at the overall landscape, plenty of original films are released. 20 or so years ago, a lot of these came from the auteur filmmakers who would often make a voice for themselves, even when working for the major studios or their subsidiaries. For example, I consider one of the best films of the 2000s to be Wes Anderson's The Royal Tenenbaums. It's a very funny movie full of fantastic character moments and making great use of its ensemble cast to tell the story of a rich family. It's full of Anderson's unique identity and visual cleverness. Other great original films from noted directors in the early 2000s include Cameron Crowe's Almost Famous, Paul Thomas Anderson's Punch Drunk Love, Sofia Coppola's Lost in Translation, Peyton Reed's Down with Love, and Quentin Tarantino's Kill Bill duology. Even if you just stuck to watching independent films, there was always something worthwhile at the smaller theaters that run those films. Some of the blockbusters produced by Hollywood also left an impression. The early 2000s was particularly dominated by the excitement over Peter Jackson's Lord of the Rings trilogy and the first few Harry Potter films. Those films and the care taken by the directors into making sure the adaptations honored the source material was one reason they left an impression. The way visual effects had evolved to help bring Middle-earth and Hogwarts to life on screen was also pivotal. Lord of the Rings, in particular, is one of those truly remarkable filmmaking achievements. There have been plenty of really good fantasy films since the launch of those two franchises, but it was quite something to see Fellowship of the Ring and The Philosopher's Stone, plus The Two Towers and Chamber of Secrets in theaters at around the same time. Ridley Scott also successfully brought back the Swords and Sandals epic with Gladiator. Sam Raimi's first two Spider-Man films are pivotal entries in the superhero movie genre, and I think Peter Jackson's King Kong is one of the best movie remakes ever. One thing I appreciate about this era was the return of the live-action film musical to prominence. Moulin Rouge is often the movie credited for doing this, and for good reason. Baz Luhrmann created a lavish, stylish jukebox musical that impressively combined 20th century songs from Elton John to Nirvana with a classic love story. This was followed the next year by Chicago, another excellent movie musical which successfully adapted Bob Fosse's iconic show with Rob Marshall's brilliant staging of the musical numbers. Both of these were films I actually watched frequently in the early 2000s, and I also have a soft spot for less admired movie musicals from this era, like Phantom of the Opera and The Producers. There were also a number of quality animated films released by Hollywood in the early to mid-2000s. Pixar produced one wonderful movie after another with Monsters, Inc., Finding Nemo, and The Incredibles. DreamWorks also gave us Chicken Run and Shrek. Meanwhile, Blue Sky launched their run of imaginative feature films with Ice Age. And even though the early 2000s was not considered the high point of Disney Animation's history, we still got The Emperor's New Groove and Lilo and Stitch, which provided a different jolt of energy to the studio and were incredibly inspired in their storytelling approaches. One genre I personally don't think flourished all that well in the early to mid-2000s was the comedy. Many comedies were mostly lowbrow, gross-out movies that relied on bottom-of-the-barrel humor to gain laughs. When I think back to the early 2000s, I largely think of it as comedy wasteland. However, there were some that snuck through the cracks. In my opinion, some worthwhile comedies that came from that time include The 40-Year-Old Virgin, Team America World Police, The Last Shot, The Producers, Sideways, The Lady Killers, Oh Brother Where Art Thou, Mean Girls, Meet the Parents, My Big Fat Greek Wedding, Kiss Kiss Bang Bang, and the aforementioned The Royal Tenenbaums and Down with Love. You just have to wade through a lot of horribly aged and moronic comedies to get to gems like those. Of course, one of my favorite directors, Steven Spielberg, was still prolific in the early 2000s, and he gave audiences dark science fiction films with AI, artificial intelligence, Minority Report, and War of the Worlds, his controversial political thriller Munich, the romantic comedy The Terminal, and my personal favorite of his films during this era, the sprightly biopic Catch Me If You Can. Meanwhile, I think Gladiator, Chicago, and The Return of the King are three of the strongest Best Picture winners in Academy Awards history, although I admit to being less fond of Million Dollar Baby and Crash. Trevon's question was asking about Hollywood, but international cinema also put out many terrific films during this time. Like any period in film history, you have some truly great films that have stood the test of time, alongside some more average works and terrible schlock. I think every decade has its highlights, and while you have some like the 70s and the 40s, which stand out for a number of reasons, you're bound to find some terrific films at any time, including the early to mid-2000s. Thank you for your question, Trevon.